Here I want to talk about low-calorie and alternative sweeteners. Zero sugar. As I was walking up York Street, I saw a big sign, zero sugar. Whenever I see zero sugar, you get very suspicious. You're like, how can it be zero sugar? There has to be something in there that's sweet. And those something sweets are some other low-calorie sweetener. So my question I want to ask is this really a magic bullet or is it a fool's gold? Here's a list of 20 and growing low-calorie or zero-calorie alternative sweeteners that you might see. Now, you might have to look pretty deep on an ingredient list to find these products, but if something says zero sugar and it looks good, it probably has at least one, probably several of these, or it might say something like proprietary blend of sweeteners, which I see a lot these days, and that's because food companies kind of mix and match these compounds to overcome different taste profiles, different properties, and so on. So these 20 sweeteners in the US at least are either FDA approved or GRAS approved. Is monk fruit still not approved here in the EU? No?
Monk fruit.
Monk fruit. Yeah. It's all the rage in the US because it's monk fruit. Sounds good, right? But we have very few studies. There are some studies, I'll review some of them. This is an epidemiological study that just looked at dietary records in the N. Haynes study, 7,000 children. And what they did was they separated them into, it says 3 groups, but it's really 4 groups now that I think about it. And they separated them based on what their predominant beverage consumption was. Water, low-calorie sweeteners, low-calorie sweetener beverages like Diet Coke, sugary beverages, regular Coke, or both Diet Coke and regular Coke. So those are the 4 groups. And they looked at the delta of calorie intake in these 3 groups relative to the water group. So they defined the kids who were consuming predominantly water as the control, and what they found was that the kids who were predominantly drinking low-calorie sweeteners were actually consuming 200 extra calories per day. Kids who were drinking regular soda were consuming 300 extra calories per day, and the combined group over 400 calories per day. But the bottom line is that even those kids who were just consuming diet beverages, they ended up consuming 2 extra calories per day. So these compounds, these beverages are doing the job at the moment of consumption, but over the day, for some reason, you end up compensating and eating more. And the same is shown for sugar. This is just the same data, but now looking at additional added sugars per day. So same thing. The children who were habitually consuming diet beverages were consuming more added sugar. So something is not quite working across the course of the day. Now, another major factor, and this has been published in a couple of different studies now, and this is one that we published a few years ago, and there's, I think now 3 studies that have shown the same thing. And here we're looking at maternal consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners. For example, women who have gestational diabetes might often be prescribed to drink non-nutritive sweeteners or diet beverages to reduce their sugar intake. And several studies have looked at the impact of that over time on their children. So this is from Project Viva, which is a large birth cohort study done in Boston. And these kids were followed for up to 18 years in some cases. And in this study, what we did was we took the dietary records from the mothers and separated them based on the consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners in the first and second trimester, and then looked at the association between that and obesity in the children. And what we found was that the impact is quite significant, even starting at an early age. One study from Canada has shown that by 1 year of age, there's a 2-fold increase in obesity in offspring. And in this study, you can see the line at the top is the orange line. It's the modeled risk line. And the BMI Z-score growth model in children whose mothers were in the highest quartile for consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners. And you can see quite clearly the effect magnifies over time. And by 18 years of age, there's a much higher BMI Z-score in those consumers. Another study I'll show you was done by my colleague. This is young adults in the magnet fMRI, and they looked at the impact of sucralose, which is the most common sweetener in the US. Does anyone know how we make sucralose? I think it's pretty common here, isn't it? Sucralose is made by adding chlorine to sugar. So it's chlorinated sugar. And what that does is it makes the sugar molecule 200 times sweeter, and it renders it inabsorbable. So it's calorie-free and very sweet. And what this study did was they took people in the magnet and gave them, in random order, either a drink of sucrose or a drink of sucralose. And they looked at the impact on appetite and reward processing. And the graphs here show you the delta signal for reward processing of sucralose versus ordinary sugar. And what they found was very interesting, was that they found a significant elevation, a significantly higher stimulation of the food reward system, but only in adults who had obesity, not among healthy weight individuals and not among overweight individuals, and also among females more than males, suggesting that the impact of these compounds, or this compound, in this case sucralose, is specific to certain segments of the population, in this case women and individuals with obesity. This is back to the Framingham Heart Study over 10 years, looking at the impact of low-calorie beverage consumption on risk of stroke and Alzheimer's disease. And I think this is also quite scary in that there's almost a threefold increase of both stroke and Alzheimer's disease among adults consuming almost daily diet soda consumption. Again, in infancy, hard to do the actual studies, and we have to look at the rat model. This, again, is my colleague Scott Konofsky's work, where he fed rats, control vehicle, ACE-K, which is another popular sweetener mostly in Diet Coke and other diet sodas, saccharin, which is not used that much anymore, or stevia. Stevia used here? Stevia, sorry. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But as you can see, in all cases, there's a significant reduction in memory performance. And over here, it just shows you when you there's no difference between the different sweeteners, and combined, there's a significant impact. This study was all the rage. I don't know if you heard about it over here, just published last month or at the end of February. That's still last month, right? On erythritol. Erythritol is also becoming quite popular in the US, also is used in mixtures. And this study found a significant association between erythritol consumption and cardiovascular risk, particular platelet activation. And what's interesting about this study is that it was an untargeted study, so they looked at blood samples from several thousand adults who had heart disease and did a metabolomic screening of the blood to look for factors that might be indicating heart disease. And one of the highest signals was coming from erythritol. And then they reproduced that in 2 other cohorts, and then they did a feeding study where they gave adults a drink with erythritol at levels that would be ordinarily consumed, and found a huge spiking in blood concentrations higher than what they found in the original study. That's a problem because erythritol is quite commonly used by the food industry to eliminate sugar And food companies are under pressure to reduce sugar, and what they're doing is replacing it with these sweeteners that have unknown or adverse effects on the body. And in particular, it's concerning these two sweeteners I'm showing here, stevia, which one is it? Or monk fruit, are both naturally occurring. So again, it's a big advantage for food companies because they can say all natural stevia, all natural monk fruit. But actually, in both cases, there's an active ingredient in the stevia leaf and an active ingredient in monk fruit. Monk fruit in itself is a fruit native to Asia that tastes terrible, but there's a compound in it called mongroside A, that's the active compound, that is hundreds of times sweeter than sugar and is not absorbed. So food companies have been able to extract this compound, put it in a bag and sell it as monk fruit, or blend it with erythritol and call it monk fruit. And I've put up here just some pros and cons. It does add sweetness. A lot of people use this because they don't want a glucose spike or they want a ketogenic diet. You see these compounds a lot in ketogenic products. It's FDA approved. But on the other side, doesn't taste that good, unknown short and long-term effects, hardly any information on how they're affecting infants or children over the long term, short term or long term. And even though they don't cause a glucose spike, the problem is they cause a glucose dip. So most people are focused on getting rid of their spikes, but if your glucose drops below where it should be, you become hypoglycemic. And when you become hypoglycemic, what are you going to do?
Go for sugar.
Look for food. Be angry and look for food. Anything can happen. So that's the big problem with these compounds, is that because they're so sweet and they activate the sweet taste receptors, they're telling the brain sugar is coming. And if the brain thinks sugar is coming, what's it going to do? It's going to take the sugar out of the blood and use it for energy. So if you take sugar out of the blood, but it doesn't come in to replace it, that's where you get the hypoglycemic. And the other factor is these compounds are all designed to not cause calorie increase, which means, where do they go? Many of them are not absorbed, so they end up in the gut being fermented by gut bacteria and can alter the gut microbiome. So my conclusion for low-calorie sweeteners, I didn't get into this in too much detail, but they're all very different. I showed you 20. They're chemically all distinct. They all have very different compounds, very different fates of metabolism. No good evidence that they produce their intended effects of lower calorie intake and reduced body weight. In fact, the opposite may be true. They may harm the gut microbiome because they mostly are not absorbed and are fermented by the gut. And they just aren't resolving craving for sweetness and may in fact increase overall consumption of calories and sugar. Consumption during pregnancy may have long-lasting and progressive effects in the offspring. They don't taste as good, and my conclusion, they're fool's gold and do not deliver on their intended purpose.